Hello everyone. In this video, we will be learning about Transcendentalism. This Transcendentalism was one of the major American literary movements of the 19th century. Before we dive into the details of this movement, let us understand what this term transcend means. It means to go beyond the limits of, exceed, or be above and independent of the physical universe. It is about questioning the limits of materialistic existence and going beyond these limits to understand what is right and what is wrong. This movement, Transcendentalism, revolves around the idea of questioning the limits and going beyond the limits. Let's see the details of this movement. Transcendentalism was a philosophical and literary movement. It developed in the late 1820s and 1830s in New England region of America. This movement emerged from the English and German Romanticism and the transcendental philosophy of Immanuel Kant. If you have been reading about British literature, you will be familiar with the term Romanticism. This Romanticism was a literary movement started by William Wordsworth in late 18th century, and we see that most of the ideas propagated by Romanticism were adapted by Transcendentalism. This movement, Transcendentalism, was also heavily influenced by Hindu religious texts on philosophy, especially the Upanishads. The concepts that were explained in these texts were taken up by the Transcendentalism movement. Main principles of Transcendentalism are given here. According to this movement, individuality, self-reliance, and non-conformity are the most important virtues that an individual should have, and this movement believed that nature is a source of truth and inspiration. If we want to seek truth, we can find it in nature. This movement appreciated the divinity of the nature. Transcendentalism saw people as outlets of the oversoul, which means that according to this movement, the physical being and the spiritual being are not discrete element. It believed that through a dynamic process, the physical being and the spiritual being are one entity, and it called it as the oversoul. This movement, Transcendentalism, opposed the materialism, capitalism, and industrialization, which was gaining prominence in the 19th century America. Another principle of this movement is that it believed that knowledge can be acquired through sensory experience, reasoning, and intuition. Rather than just accepting the facts that are given to us, we should use our reasoning abilities to understand whether the given fact is right or wrong, or we have to use our intuition. If we have to use intuition to seek knowledge, that is what this movement believed in. Here is a small history of American literary movements. You can see here that this literary movements in America began with Puritan era, then Age of Reason, Romanticism, and then Transcendentalism. Then came Realism, Modernism, and contemporary postmodernism. The purpose of adding this slide is to understand that Romanticism and Transcendentalism almost emerged around the same time in the first half of the 19th century. We can see that the timeline of Romanticism and Transcendentalism almost overlaps, and that's why we can find many similarities between Romanticism and Transcendentalism. Yet these two movements had their own differences, and the differences between Romanticism and Transcendentalism can be seen in the later slides. Transcendental Timeline. The people who founded this movement, the people who believed in this movement, and the people who followed this movement are called as Transcendentalists. Here are some of the major Transcendentalists producing the Transcendental text. The timeline of the Transcendental text is given here. The major Transcendentalists include Bronson Alcott, George Ripley, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Theodore Parker, William Henry Channing, and Henry David Thoreau. If you observe this timeline, you will see that most of the important transcendental texts were produced between 1830 to 1860, and that's why this period between 1830 to 1860 is considered as the peak of Transcendentalism. Now, Transcendental Club. It was a group of New England authors, philosophers, socialists, politicians, and intellectuals. The people who believed in this movement, they gathered together and they started this club called as Transcendental Club. It was established in September 1836, and this club was nicknamed as the Brotherhood of the Like-Minded. Some of the important members of this club include Ralph Waldo Emerson, George Pitman, Amos Branson Alcott, Margaret Fuller, Theodore Parker, Henry David Thoreau, W.H. Channing, and Sophia Ripley. These are not the only Transcendentalists, but these are some of the major Transcendentalists of the Transcendental Club. Now, to express their views of Transcendentalism to a more bigger audience, they started a magazine called The Dial. Okay, the first issue of this magazine was written by Emerson, titled as Journal in a New Spirit. It was published in July 1840. Emerson's essay Nature has been considered as a manifesto of transcendentalist ideas. It consisted most of the beliefs, principles, and ideas of the transcendentalism, and this text, Nature, is considered as one of the most important transcendental texts. Now let's look at some of the major transcendentalists. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he was an American essayist, philosopher, and abolitionist. He was the person who led the Transcendentalism movement in 1970. He is considered as the father of Transcendentalism movement. He was a champion of individualism and critical thinking. If you remember, individualism is one of the important principles of Transcendentalism movement. His essay collections are given here, and some of his important essays include Nature, Self-Reliance, The Oversoul, The Poet, Experiences, and The American Scholar. Most of his works consisted of the transcendental beliefs like individuality. He emphasized on individuality, and he also focused on self-reliance in his works. The next major transcendentalist is Margaret Fuller. She was an American journalist, editor, critic, translator, and women's rights advocate. She was the first American female war correspondent and full-time book reviewer in journalism. She agreed with most of the beliefs of Transcendentalism movement, but she refused to be called herself as a Transcendentalist. She was also the one who criticized Emerson for focusing too much on individual improvement and not enough on social reform. Her famous works include Summer on the Lakes, Women in the 19th Century, Papers on Literature and Art. Henry David Thoreau. He is also one of the most important transcendentalists. He was an American naturalist, essayist, poet, abolitionist, and philosopher. His lasting contributions are his writings on natural history and philosophy. Thoreau's writings influenced political leaders and reformers like Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and many other artists and authors. His essay, Civil Disobedience, talked about the peaceful disobedience with which we can question the authority. And the element of non-conformity also we can see here in this essay. His another work, Walden, is also considered as one of the important texts of the Transcendentalism movement. Walt Pitman is another major transcendentalist. He was an American poet, essayist, and journalist. He incorporated both transcendentalism and realism elements in his writings and is often called as the father of free verse. He used transcendental themes such as nature and the common man in his poems like I Saw in Louisiana, A Live Oak Growing, and his other poems are mentioned here. Walt Whitman's poem Song of Myself is a celebration of individualism. Again, individualism is one of the most important principles of Transcendentalism movement. His famous works include Leaves of Grass, Democratic Vistas, and Passage to India. Let us have a quick look over the differences between Romanticism and Transcendentalism. The literary movement, Romanticism, started at the end of 18th century and reached its peak around 1840. It started in Britain in late 18th century, but it came to America at around the first decades of the 19th century. Transcendentalism started around 1834 and lasted till approximately 1860. The style of writing of Romanticism included moral values, individualism, creativity, freedom, and emotions. Individualism is again adapted by transcendentalism. The style of writing of transcendentalism focused fully on the content of writing and not defined in a particular one or two types. What this means here is that when we see the works of Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman, we cannot put together their works in the same frame, because yes, they were both transcendentalists. They included the transcendental themes in their works, but they did not define a particular genre or a framework for their works. Romanticism was highly dependent on observations from natural senses, feelings, and emotions, while transcendentalism was highly dependent on guidance from inner light and intuition. The individualism is championed here in transcendentalism. Religion. According to Romanticism, religion was meant to be worked on a personal inner basis, resulting in good or evil. Here we can notice the difference between the conception of religion between the Romanticism and Transcendentalism. The Transcendentalists rejected the religious dogma but believed that God's presence is everywhere and hence God can be found by intuition. The oversoul concept here is propagated by the Transcendentalism. Reaction. Romanticism was a reaction against outward experiences and objective reasoning, while Transcendentalism was a reaction against religious traditions, beliefs, and dogma which overpowered humans. Conclusion. Transcendentalism influenced the thinking of American Renaissance, the period before the Civil War. As I said, Transcendentalism was one of the major literary movements of American history, and it has affected the way that the people thought in the 19th century America. The most creative minds of this period were inspired by its pragmatic ideology of confidence, self-identity, spiritual progress, and social justice. We can see the themes of self-identity, spiritual progress, and social justice in the works of Emerson and Thoreau. Edgar Allan Poe, who was a romantic writer, he criticized this movement by saying that transcendentalism was mysticism for mysticism's sake. Though both the Romanticism and Transcendentalism had many similarities between them, the Romantic writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne heavily criticized Transcendentalism movement. We have observed that the Transcendentalism flourished between 1830s to 1860s, but soon after the 1860s, the Transcendentalism sort of dwindled. But despite this, the Transcendentalism have persisted and became foundational in American thought. With this, I conclude this video on Transcendentalism. Thank you for listening.